Is a pleasant way of saying.
There it is.
What was that, Jeff?
I think that's a pleasant way of saying, Jeff, your children are loud.
Yeah, Jeff, knock it off.
This is a slice of life podcast. Catch us where we are.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. Reaction in the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Untold stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We are four veterans who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military SF, the greatest niche within a niche of any fiction, more niche than the Coast Guard. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than 60 novels, including Contact Front and the Drop Trooper series, Jeffrey H. Haskell, author of the Grimm's War series, Josh Hayes, author of the Valor series, and operations manager and head of thriller acquisitions for Aethon Books. And I'm James S. Aaron, author of the An 14 Sentience Wars series and the Galactic Law series. So between the four of us, we bring more than 100 novels written, although most of that is Rick, which I continue to say every week because it continues to be true. And more than 30 years publishing experience and I don't know, maybe 50 years military experience, but author and enlisted, because we'd be retired by now if any of us had stuck around. So
Author and enlisted.
Officer and
Officer and enlisted. Did I say author and enlisted? Yeah. So you can join our Discord server to complain about the show or tell us everything you love because we need your affirmation. All right. So today we're talking about future military, like conceiving of future militaries that are relatable to today's readers, because it's cool to imagine the way things could be, and technology continues to change and evolve, but readers like to relate to what they know now for a satisfying story, right? Jeff, since you missed last week, why don't we start with you? And when you think about creating a relatable, well, let's talk about combined arms in general, because I know Grimm's War is very Navy, you got some Army, but what were some considerations you made in conceiving of that military, you know, from everything to do the mission, the culture, where did you start?
well, even going back to my superhero stuff, one of the things that I've always felt like was really important is things didn't just exist in a void. There had to be a reason why things exist. Like the Air Force used to be the Army Air Corps, and they split for a reason. They had different missions. And so when I was coming up with the Grimm's War stuff, one, it started with just the Navy because that was going to be the core of it, and then it spread to the Marines because obviously if you have Navy, you're going to have Marines. At some point, I added the Army, but when I added the Army, I had to decide like what is their mission, because the Army and the Marines have a lot of overlap in what they do. But the Army does everything, right? The U.S. Army does everything. They have more boats than the Navy, more planes than the Air Force, and more infantry than the Marines. So it's like, what would their mission be in a future where you had Navy and you had Marines doing the things that Army does today? There wouldn't be any big, ground invasions because moving, hundreds of thousands of troops across space just isn't practical. And, having that kind of supply line where you're takes months to get places isn't practical either. So for me, what I came up with is the Army exists as garrison troops. So they run the prisons, they run the camps, they run the logistics, and as special forces troops. So kind of like specialized into those two things. And if you look at what the U.S. Army does today, it's a lot of that. They run all the forts, they run the camps, they run the logistics. The Army, all the Army helicopters and transports that do stuff, C-130s and whatnot. I mean, a lot of those will have Air Force crews, or a lot of them have Army crews, and they do all kinds of that sort of thing. So, I try to stay as close to what is as recognizable as a military as possible. Because, yeah, you could invent your military from the ground up, but you're never going to do anything as good as it already exists. It's never going to feel like a real military if you just decide whole ham to, like, I'm going to come up with new ranks. First Globart, none of it's going to make any sense to people, and you're going to have to do a lot of work explaining things to someone who would rather you just said it's a first officer, than some other weird, name that you come up with.
As much as
One
I
of the
love
things I
some
liked
writers
I always
here,
wanted to be a first glow Bart.
I know. It's like
One of the things I liked about your series, Jeff, it was and I'm sure this isn't really special to you or just significant to you, but the German ranks that you had in your books. Sometimes in sci-fi you get nailed down into like captain, major, or whatever. The captain of a ship is just the captain of a ship, and sometimes you can forget that different nations have different words in their language for what that is. And
Did you have the
I love that
Oberleutnant?
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
over left. What was it? Over.
Oberleutnant.
What a lieutenant is.
Yeah.
There were Kriegs and yeah.
Really quickly too, you mentioned Space Force at the opening, James. I just want to say that I was Space Command before Space Force was cool, way back in the day.
That's
And
funny because everybody accused Trump of stealing Star Trek's emblem for Space
Yeah,
Force.
oh,
no,
no, it was on
this
there.
it was a
already on there.
long time ago. And this is Air Force Space Command, but it not technically the same thing, but it's still funny.
No, I think
It's
that's
funny that the Air
good
Force
point
came
about
from the
the-
Army and now Space Force comes from the Air Force.
For
Mhm.
sure.
Well,
I
that's
think that's a good example too of how people fight against even change within like we create a new force for a reason and there's just a lot of heartache about it. But go ahead, Rick. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
so that's another bone of contention for future military science fiction is when we have starships, when we have space combat ships in space, will they be organized along Air Force lines or Navy lines?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. There was a show a long time ago called Space Above and Beyond.
Yeah,
It ran for like maybe 1 or 2 seasons.
One
I
season.
think.
one
Yeah.
season,
Back when seasons were
Um,
26 episodes long.
Right. And I'm fairly certain that they were using Air Force.
Marines.
they were Marines.
Was it
They were all-
Marines? Okay.
They were all using Marine
the
ranks. Yeah.
Marines. The Marines were pilots and ground troops at the same time. However,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
made
yeah.
that.
Somebody took that
Yeah.
every Marine a rifleman to heart.
Yeah,
Right.
every Marine a pilot and a rifleman.
Mhm. I think that like James, what you were saying about creating stuff out of whole cloth for military structures in terms of rank, there are certain things that you can do or that you should be doing in your far future science fiction, if that's what you're writing, that make it distinct. But playing with like the reason we use the major reason I think we use modern military as a model for structuring what we write about is that one, it's simple, and two, it's relatable to the reader. And
Mhm.
so they're not having to do the mental gymnastics to figure out what you're talking about. It's already there. It's that is what they know. It's just presented in a different context. But some things I think you can kind of play around with in words. Like for instance, in weaponized, instead of hacking, I use the term spiking. But it's little small like terminology things that you can adjust in your world. Like instead of the internet or like a worldwide network, I use the term data sphere, and in the middle S is capitalized. And that's their thing, and they talk about that. But when you start doing stuff like creating new ranks, that kind of gets confusing. Well, for you to create them, but also when you're going through and you're reading, Lieutenant something said this, or Lieutenant or something something name said this, the reader is always going to have to go, what rank
Right.
was that? And where do they fall in the chain of command and in the operational structure of the ranking system or the ship or wherever you're talking about? You're always going to have that backup out of the story, that takeout of what's going on to figure out the context of what's happening.
I think there's
I
also
did add ranks in mine,
Yeah.
but they were all like junior grade, senior grade, because they have genetic aging, rejuvenation, treatments that you can do twice, I think is what it is. So you can like basically double your regular or useful lifespan. So they added like junior grade ranks to captain and stuff like that just to space things out a little. But the adding whole other ranks though to with new terminology, yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a mistake. Someone probably could do it and get away with it. I know somebody who mixed ranks on their in their book, and he's a
Interesting.
good
Like going
storyteller.
between like Navy
But
and like
there were both
Army,
Navy
say?
and Army ranks on the ship,
Interesting.
and they were in the same they were in the same service,
Hmm.
and it was really in my mind, it was really every time I came across an Army rank, but they were a Navy person, I was just like, well,
Threw you off.
Yeah.
in my
I
head.
think doesn't the Russian military kind of do something similar where their terminology kind of blends in the Navy? I want to say, no, I can't remember. I remember reading Hunt for Red October and thinking that there was a couple of strange things that popped out to me about their ranking system, but I could be remembering it wrong.
I've experimented with like inventing new ranks in different books, like in Wholesale Slaughter, it takes place really far in the future. And I made, instead of having first and second lieutenants, I had sub-lieutenant and lieutenant,
Yeah.
which was a minor thing. I just wanted there to be like a noticeable difference in things because it is so far in the future. One of my original books that I tried to write that never got published, I had the space fleet have kind of rearranged ranks with the captain of the ship basically being called commander, and it was a rank. But it kind of felt unnatural, so I never went with that when I rewrote parts of that book to get published. But I did experiment with it. It's although I found that people who read military science fiction are very, very resistant to change and
Right.
don't want you to experiment and don't want you to do anything different
That's
than
what I was going to bring up. I
21st
think people
century.
bring a certain level of nostalgia to it that they might be looking for. And when you
Yeah,
start
for
messing
sure.
with rank, you're messing with their preconception about why they're coming to the story in the first place. They were a sergeant, they want to read about a sergeant. A lieutenant, they want to read about a lieutenant. But one thing that irritates me too, which I think irritates me, lots of things irritate me. What grinds my gears? People that don't consider the kind of span of control or scope of a certain rank. And, when you even consider that future military, like what a sergeant can do, what information a sergeant has. A sergeant has control of a squad, depending. Or if a sergeant is a platoon sergeant, like that immediately starts pointing out to you, there's problems here, So, but just things like that, when it's obvious to me that people don't understand what that is or really use it effectively. Like I've always been I love the idea of an aide de camp with a general. One of my favorite books is Armies of Night, where the main character is a first lieutenant who is an aide de camp. And so because things are told through his point of view, he's got all his idealistic preconceptions. And then part of the arc is what he learns, as he watches the general make the decisions and do things that he doesn't understand, so that kind of thing is always interesting to me. But I think it's an important thing to consider, even when you're imagining a military in the future, that especially people with hopped up ranks or people thrown into a situation that have way more power than they probably should, or would in a real military.
Well, I don't know about that because it depends on the situation. Like, for
Yeah.
instance, my son was a Spec 4,
hmm
and he was activated in the Florida National Guard during COVID and put in first a testing center and then a vaccination center. And because of the lack of people, he was put into a position that should have been held by an E7. So he's like in charge of this, not the whole installation, but like a big section of the installation. that where all this is going on and has all this responsibility and no authority.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's what I mean.
Well, I
Like
think
that's
like
if you know,
that could be a purposeful thing. Like
Right,
Jeff
right.
did that with Grimm. Not, he's kind of should maybe for that position could have been a higher rank than he was, and they kind of put him in a position he wasn't ready for almost. But I think if as long as you're doing that purposefully instead of just doing it accidentally and not on purpose, and you don't really understand, it's like knowing that a captain can be the captain of a ship, but not a captain in rank, right? Like those small things. Like you can be a lieutenant commander and still be the captain of a ship. Depending on what type of ship it is, depending, you could be
And
a
depending on
captain of
what
a-
your chain of command is, you may have authority to tell somebody of higher rank what to do,
Right.
or to say no to them if they don't have the orders backing them up to give them command of your ship. So, like, if you have a captain of a ship, and what's it? Not an admiral, but it's above captain. Commodore comes along and it's like, I want you to do this with your ship, and like, I'm not in your fleet. I'm not in your.
right.
I can't just take your orders and take my ship out someplace and blow things up just because you said so.
Right.
I've got to see some actual orders. So, and I think a lot of people lose that when they're writing fiction, is that they just think that, oh, such and such rank, he can just tell people what to do, when to do it, and like, yes and no. I mean, obviously, if you're a private and a colonel tells you what to do, you're going to do it no matter what it is. But
Right.
if you're the captain of a infantry company, and some random colonel shows up from logistics and says, "Hey, I need you to take your entire infantry company and go do this over here," you're gonna be like, "Yeah, I'm gonna need to see some orders from my chain of command on that, sir." Yeah.
There's a perfect example of that. The communication between lower and higher ranking officers in a book I think we've all read. I'm not going to dime him out here. That'd be rude. And I like the guy, but they were in the middle of this combat situation right in the beginning of the book. It was the opening, like one or two or three chapters, and the captain's giving orders because the ship's in combat, and the ensign, who is, I think, the helmsman, is like arguing with the captain, like, that's not a good idea. We shouldn't do this, blah, blah, blah. And that
I think I've
just
read that
would
book.
not, yeah, it just would not happen in an actual standing military. Like maybe if you have like some
The
kind
next
of
words out of the captain's mouth would be, "You stand relieved."
Right.
100%. Yeah. I mean, if you've got like a mercenary ship or something like that where order and
Pirates.
discipline are not like key to the organizational function, then yeah, okay, I could see that. But if you're writing a legitimate standing military, the like free will is not an option most of the
Right.
time. Like you've got to do.
It depends on I mean, yeah, on a ship like that, definitely. Sometimes I have seen in real life examples where, say with infantry or Marines, that sometimes you do get people of lower rank arguing with people of higher rank.
Oh, for sure. I'm
Especially
not
like
saying
when
it
the
doesn't
person,
happen.
especially when the person of higher rank is foobar, like calls in the wrong artillery coordinates.
Right. Well, typically you're going to see that in like infantry settings or ground combat situations, maybe where they're arguing with lieutenant or something like that. But I mean, the captain of a ship he's God in that circumstance, and unless he's doing something illegal or that is no calculating wrong, and in that case the executive officer is probably going to take a stand, but it's not going to be an ensign helmsman
No.
correcting the.
It would be like in that scene of Band of Brothers where they're in the Netherlands, and they find those German troops, and they all sneak into that line, right? And they're going to attack the troops. You guys know the scene I'm talking about. And he throws that smoke grenade. This is a perfect example of this being done legitimately, right? The captain, guy in charge of the whole company, tells them to go on smoke. Dude throws the smoke, and the captain runs and charges by himself because his XO or whatever is like, no, he said go on smoke. And any one of those guys could have been like, no, we're going, and jumped up, but they were all obeying the orders of their lieutenant, who was like, no, he said go on smoke.
Right.
And it's a perfect example of a legitimate, place where anybody could have disobeyed
Misinterpretation.
that guy and been okay.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
was watching. I don't know if you've ever seen The Outpost.
Mm-mm.
It's about Cop Keating in Afghanistan in the Korengal Valley, I believe.
Yeah.
And there's a scene where the new captain who's in charge of the cop who's just come in there, is calling on a artillery strike on some people that are firing on them from up in the mountains. And I think it was a sergeant breaks into the radio and says, "Sir, you're going to put those rounds 40 miles east of here. What you mean is,"
Yeah.
it's also the right coordinates.
Well,
Right.
Is that
There's
the
a great
movie where the
story.
captain shoots the dog because they claim the dog bit them?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
yeah. Well, later on, there's a story where a lieutenant like makes, I can't remember which cop it was from. It was in the Korengal though, but he wants to go talk to some elders, and they know it's a terrible idea, but they all go with him anyway, and then get ambushed on the way back. And I'm like, man, somebody should have grabbed him and thrown him on the ground. But
Right.
I don't know. You see where, but it goes both ways. Like where people, that's the military structure, and I think you can understanding it and using it effectively is really, it's when it's used poorly that it just detracts so much, but when it's used well, it creates those moments of like either victory or tragedy, or you can really amp up. That's the kind of thing in a military story that won't be in other kinds of stories, especially where duty conflicts with maybe common sense in that way, but that's the kind of thing that I don't know, it can be especially hard. Like if you don't set up those rules to begin with, like if you do like I think if a reader is going to trust you, if they come into that situation where you've got either like a person of a lower rank who's in a much higher position that they shouldn't be in, or you walk into a command structure where there's a lot of, talking back, or maybe no talking back because everybody's terrified of the commander. Like those are things that you can really play on if if you know it and are doing it to a purpose. I think people get confused or don't understand when it's kind of a very generic sort of setting, and people start to like basically ignore anything else that's happening in the story because these details aren't right.
You got to spread it out too. Like every commander can't be an incompetent a-hole.
Right.
Every sergeant can't be, I said stand at attention. The guy from,
Knife hand.
yeah,
Generation Kill.
every private isn't an idiot. Every aviator isn't a cocky jackass. I mean, like you got to mix things up a little bit. Believe it or not, I know you two were officers, and me and Josh were just lowly enlisted. But believe it or not, there are officers who are good at their job. Their job is not my job.
Mhm.
That was another thing too. People have a hard time understanding. Officers didn't do enlisted job. Half the time they were only vaguely aware of what your job was. They're administrators, at least the non-combat guys.
Right.
It's why you don't see, Lieutenant Navy SEALs going out with the chief petty officers who are Navy SEALs. The enlisted do their job, they do it very well, and they do it for a long time. In order for an officer to have that comparable experience, they'd have to be like a colonel or a commander. And, at that point, they're, not going to be sending those guys out into the field to do, spec ops stuff that the master chief can do 10 times better than they'll ever do.
And there's so few of
That's
those
one of the
jobs.
things that,
Different jobs,
That's one of the things that David Weber does really well with Honor Harrington, even though it kind of pushes the books in a different direction than when they like the core or like 7 or 8 Honor Harrington novels. But as she promotes and gains responsibility and gains command authority and moves up the structure, her responsibilities and her roles change. And she goes from being kind of a frontline ship commander to she's kind of playing diplomat, and now she's commanding whole navies instead of just a ship. And that can be a hang up at times when if you're wanting to write a quote unquote like an action packed military story, but your main character is an admiral and they've got to have briefings all day. It doesn't work out.
Well, I ran into that with my first series that I wrote, Duty Honor Plan. I started out, the main character was a lieutenant, and he was leading kind of a special forces type of team. It was experimental. It was like a new thing they were trying because this is in the far future, and there hadn't been any special forces for a while because they hadn't really needed them. But as the books went along, he kept getting promoted.
Mhm.
And by the last book, at the halfway through the last book, he was a general. And it required a lot of imagination and mental gymnastics to get him into a position where he actually had people shooting at him or something like that. You know, it was like, and even when it happened, when he put himself on this mission, everybody was arguing, saying, "No, you should stay here."
Right.
But he's like, "Well, this is a special situation because they had interstellar flight, but no interstellar communications. So I have to be there to make this decision." And it was like everybody was like, "Yeah, sure you do." You just want to
Well,
get back out in the
Right.
field.
one of the battalion commanders in the Korengal had a death wish. Like he was so depressed about the mission, and he started to get, and it affected his whole command. But he kept putting himself in situations where like they'd be on the main road up the valley, and they come under fire, and he'd jump out of the Humvee and start shooting at people with his 9mm. And his soldiers were like conflicted about it because I mean, I guess they respected that he would get out there, but then it was like the soldiers were like, "Sir, this is not that same kind of thing. Sorry,
It's not your
fair."
job.
Right. You get whacked.
Patton did the same thing.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think one of the things that when we're talking about like creating structure or creating sci-fi elements, the only thing that I really take some liberty with is um, like the actual organizational structure of things. But a lot of times I'll take inspiration from actual units. Like in Weaponized, I had to create a organizational structure for the Sentinel Corps, which is basically futuristic kind of armored Navy SEAL type deal. And I did a lot of research on like what do Navy SEAL teams look like? What do MARSOC teams look like? What do like all these kind of modern day special operations teams, what do they look like? You talk about a ranger, and a lot of people think about rangers as kind of special operators, but rangers actually operate in really big numbers. Whereas like SEALs or MARSOC or like even Delta Force would be probably the smallest and probably the best example of this, but they operate in like groups of 6 to 8, and so I look at that and I kind of put it all together and I go, what works out best for the story, and then I pick a number and then I just saturate the command through that, and I don't do a whole lot of like world building in that aspect. Most of it's just for my knowledge. So when I'm talking about things, I can write them accurately. Um, but I think those things are okay to play with. Like you're talking about like fleet sizes or what is in a fleet. Like you don't necessarily need to look at the modern U.S. Navy fleet and go, these are the ships that are in the fleet, and we need the exact number and the exact types,
Yeah.
because you're going to
because it
have
changes too, you know.
it's going to change.
Yeah.
Space navies are obviously different than
Like I invented, different ship models for I mean,
sure.
they call them things like the Navy would, like a cruiser, but it has no relation to, the current cruisers, which if we even have them anymore. Do we have cruisers? I don't remember. But
We
I
do
don't
have
know.
cruisers. Yeah,
do-
no.
but-
We have guided missile cruisers, guided missile
yeah,
destroyers. It's all about, for the Navy, it's all about the role. When I was in the Army, it was 25 man to a squad, 100 guys.
25 men to a squad.
Yeah, well, I was logistics. I was a combat signaler, and so we had 100 guys in a platoon, 400 guys in a company. That's not how that is in infantry. And
We had 8.
it's also
Eight to a
based
squad.
and it's also based on, we didn't have fire teams. You guys did,
Yeah.
It's also based on what's available. If you've got a glut of people available, then you're going to have bigger units. And the same thing with the Navy. In World War II, a destroyer squadron would be 2 or 3 destroyers, and now they don't have destroyer squadrons except for special circumstances, because destroyers are always paired with other ships. So it varies. It depends on the mission, and it depends on the situation.
And also
And that's the other thing with I was going to say about the Space Force versus Space Navy. That's going to depend on, I like in books where, in universes where they have a faster than light drive that's kind of hyperspace like, and they can get places really fast and jump around, that invites more of an Air Force type structure, because if you can get somewhere very fast and you have communications, then that's more in line with what the Air Force does. If you have like jump gates and you have to go out and it takes months to get to another solar system or something, and you're out of communication the whole time, then that invites more of a Navy type structure, because the commander of that ship has to be autonomous and have a lot of authority, because he's making the decisions that are going to be, making foreign policy, basically, like the captains back in the 19th, 18th century. But if you have interstellar communications instantaneous, well, then you can have, headquarters looking over your shoulder and radioing your starship like they do F-16s nowadays, or F-35s.
That's something I was just thinking about too. Like I'm not as knowledgeable on naval history, which I think our Navy is based on the British Navy, but Prussian and Clausewitz just still has a huge cast of shadow on the way our Army is and
We're
ground
based
units
on the British
organized.
Navy, except less rum, sodomy, and the lash.
Right. We're not all drunk. But
Good
I wonder
period,
about,
yeah.
cultural influences in the way, and this is maybe something to talk about too. Like a lot of other, when we look at, training with NATO units, which tend to be, European, have been European, or more comfortable with those kind of, original Prussian concepts of organization and hierarchy and things like that, how that potentially clashes with the way other cultures might do things and how they organize their militaries and how, their combat effectiveness based on just ideas about, am I going to listen to what somebody else says or things of that nature. And I'm not knowledgeable enough to speak about it, but it's something that I do think about sometimes. Like it's sort of a blind spot for me. I mean, I think about things the way the Army did it, because that's what I was trained to do, from a young age. I didn't even read Clausewitz until ROTC, and then it was like, oh, that's why we do stuff like that. That's why we're organized like that. And then you realize, like, we're only organized like that because this guy came over and trained revolutionary troops, but those are things I think, if you set that kind of groundwork potentially, or if you lay that out, then I think your reader will understand why you make certain decisions later on. It's just sometimes, depending on who your readers are, they're just going to make those assumptions to begin with because that's how they were trained and that's what they know.
Well, my Grim books, the majority of the weapons that the Alliance uses are all coil guns of some form or another. And in one of the books, they're repairing the ship, and one of the spacers is like, so why do we use coil guns? And the guy, gave them this great little history lesson about how the Systems Alliance Navy started as merchants.
Mm-hmm.
They were co-opted merchant vessels, basically shooting what they had, which was coil guns, using round shot against pirates. And then the pirates developed armor that would deflect the round shot, so they had to develop APDS, and they basically had to reinvent the wheel, because even though they had come from Earth, they didn't have that technology with them when they came. I mean, who thinks to bring, the technology to create depleted uranium APDS, arrows when you're going to colonize a planet?
Well, if you have access to asteroid mining, you might be better off using tungsten instead of depleted uranium. But
well, I mean, that's what they, yeah, well, that's what they do. They do use tungsten. They use tungsten wrapped in steel so they can shoot it down the coils. And yeah,
that's a good example though for different situations. Like in a couple of my books, it's like against the laws of war to use rail guns or coil guns in a system, because if it's a inhabited system, you're going to be leaving all this space junk flying through the shipping lanes, and they're worried about that hitting civilian ships. So they require you to use guided missiles or beam weapons. And pirates use rail guns and coil guns, and that's considered like tantamount to a war crime.
Breaking the law. But that's, I mean, that's the fun kind of cultural stuff that I think, we talked previously about constraints on your characters, and that's the kind of thing that makes it interesting, right? If it's just too easy for them, or it might be a reason like, why do I have to follow this stupid law of warfare? Or they're not going to do it. Why do I have to do it? And, what is a moral leader in that circumstance? Um, there's something else I was thinking about from a broader perspective as far as organization goes. And I guess, Rick, you kind of touched on it with setting up your world from the very beginning, but do you start with like, okay, I want to tell a story, and I know you've done this several times, so it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it. Like, do you start with the technology and then, or, kind of lay in the terrain and then build the military out of that? Or do you have an idea for kind of interesting military organization you'd like to explore and then build the tech around that to kind of fit it?
Well, I mean, I start with kind of a setting and I not like a detail, but an idea of what kind of a future history it is. And I do kind of start with some of the technology because if I have an idea for a plot that requires them to have really slow travel, then I'll build that in, or vice versa. But if I don't have that requirement, like with the idea ahead of time, then I will say, okay, yeah, they discovered, faster than light travel through these gateways, and the gateways are hard to build, and there's not very many of them, and that pretty much defines what kind of a military you have. If you have fixed gateways in space that are there, and everybody knows they're there, and you can't build new ones, or it's really hard to build new ones, and it takes a lot of effort, then that means you're going to have mines and drones and defense platforms lined up all around these gates. And getting through them is going to be a big plot point. How do you get through all those defenses? On the other hand, if you have something like Star Wars or Battlestar Galactica, or you can jump in and out of hyperspace, well, how do you defend against that? Because that's like a lightning raid from pirates could take out anything on any planet.
It's
You
like an
have-
F-22,
Yeah.
they can go anywhere and you don't know they're there until you're under fire.
So you have
One of
you
the
have to
thing-
come up with something like if you want to have an interstellar civilization in a world where they have that, you have to come up with something like defense shields or some kind of defense that allows you not to get, or some technical limitation, like you can't jump in closer than a certain distance. So like
That's kind of what I
usually-
did.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say that's kind of what I did, which I only kind of stole from David Weber was he has a thing called a hyperlimit, but I kind of made it a little bit smaller. But there's limits on where ships can jump into
Because of gravity.
in terms of distance and even points along the planet and in the orbit of like Peter F. Hamilton used Lagrange points for his jump areas, and because I don't have stargates, I wanted to come up with a reason for like actual flight, right? Instead of just going through hyper and having, I have a ship in a sequence in book 2 that they've got to escape this space station that's under fire. And like in Star Wars, you just get in the ship and hit hyperspace, and of course it may ruin a whole bunch of stuff, but it's possible. And I wanted to
Got to calculate the
put in-
coordinates right, or you go too close
That's
to a
right.
black hole, or
yeah. But I wanted to give
I'll end your
a
little trip
reason
real
to have
quick,
kind
won't
of a space chase, and have, they've got to fly through this asteroid field, which I know is not practical, but whatever. It's cool
Rule of
and I
cool.
like it.
You know the odds of successfully navigating an asteroid field, Josh?
Never tell me the odds. But anyway, yeah. So like you come up with kind of things like that, then and it adds to your story rather than taking it away, and stuff like that, like where you're flying through an asteroid field. Maybe it's not realistic, but it's it's not going to be something that's going to pull somebody out of the story like a really simple like misrank or misaddress or improperly structured kind of thing, especially in the genre that we're talking about here. And
You miss
most of,
you. I think you underestimate the average military science fiction fan. I've been lectured because I got orbital mechanics wrong, or like I mistimed the how long it would take a shuttle to get from low orbit to the planet.
That's why I
Well,
never
I
give
think
people all the information. I give them
right.
expressions, not equations.
Well,
Exactly.
and I think those readers are very few and far between. And I think the overwhelming majority of readers will be able to overlook something like getting the timing from orbit to the surface wrong. But if you get a rank or a type of address or a title or something like that wrong, they're going to burn you over the coals for it, because that's something that they're expecting and that they are really wanting from the genre.
Yeah.
Some people
Um,
just that's what they want is
I
to
just
find
want to point
things.
out, and I think you all should agree with me on this one, is that we love all of our readers to buy our books and spend their hard-earned money and time reading our stuff. And if they want to spend even more time figuring out that I did the math wrong, I appreciate that, because that means they really love the story. And
Yep.
you can't get that kind of engagement when you're writing this crap. So
For sure. 100%.
yeah.
100%.
I'm glad I gave you some kind of emotion, be it disappointment, deep disappointment.
Well, I was going to say one of the ways I limit, for example, the big in my biggest series universe, they have what's called a transition drive, and it follows basically gravitational lines of force between stars, and you can't. It creates like a small temporary wormhole to go through, and you can't make that wormhole form anywhere within a certain distance from a gravitational field, like a planetary gravitational field. So they have to get like beyond for Earth, it'd be like beyond the orbit of the moon before they can form a transition entrance. So that makes them have to have space battles that they can't just jump out of.
one of the things I did that I like to take like ideas that people have had and sort of like kick them on their side a little bit. So with Grimm's War, you have to come to a complete stop in order to transition to faster than light. So it's not one of those things where like you have this
Not
running
possible to come to
battle.
a complete stop in space.
It is tough to come to a complete stop in space, and you also have to get rid of your active emissions because you have to find the gravity lane, the star lane between stars, and it's hard to do that when you're being pelted with electromagnetic energy. So it creates a lot of attention of like, okay, can we get to this lane, come to a stop, find the transition point, and then go before they catch up and destroy us? Because the bad guys don't have to catch up and stop and attack you. They can just fly right by, keep accelerating. So it builds a lot of tension when you've got to do stuff where it's like you can't just hit a button and go. Like with Rick, where you gotta get beyond the orbit of the moon, or you have to get out past the hyperlimit or whatnot.
I think it's really interesting, and something I've explored a couple of times is when you have two different like cultures or species that use two different types of faster than light drive, and how that interacts with their military structure and strategy.
I agree. I like reading it. I don't like writing it, because then I have to come up with two different things and I'm already having problems coming up with one.
Like for instance, if you have one guy that uses like a warp drive or isolink, star drive type deal, and the other one uses a Stargate, it's each one has its advantage, because something like a warp drive in reality would require a huge power source. So you'd have huge ships, and they can't sneak around. I mean, they're going to be putting out lots of energy, and you can see them from, probably millions of kilometers away. Meanwhile, the guys with the gates, they could just put like tiny ships through those gates, and you'd never know they went through.
Or just missiles. You
Or
put missiles
missiles.
through the gate. Speaking of gates, and I know this is kind of off from organization, and I can't remember if one of you guys talked about it. Rick, maybe it was you, but the Peter F. Hamilton in his Pandora Star duology, well, most of his Commonwealth Saga, the stargates, the intergalactic travel is actually trains
Yeah.
on the planets, and they open up wormholes. They call them zero width wormholes that are just always open, and you can go from planet to planet to planet to planet on this train network.
Oh, that's such a
Uh,
cool
Wasn't
idea.
that the great
it's
wasn't that the Great North Road where he had that?
no. Well, they might have had something similar in the Great North Road, but for Pandora's Star and Judas Unchained, that particular series, that was the only way to travel. There were no spaceships. There were absolutely no spaceships.
Well, they had
It
to
was
build
all-
one.
They had to build one. And
Yeah.
that came into play later on in the story when they actually had to build a spaceship and figure out how they were going to do it and the logistics involved and all that stuff. But that kind of cool system really led to a lot of, what happens when you shut the wormholes down and now a planet doesn't have a connection to go anywhere
Mhm.
and they don't have a spaceship. Like, those are very interesting concepts. But it was also really cool to see, they still had planes and like stuff that you would, I mean, there were sci-fi planes, right? But it was interesting to see a culture develop that was an intergalactic culture that wasn't determinant on space travel, but that was outside the realm of our talk today. I just thought about it and I want to throw it in.
That train idea is awesome.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's-
if you haven't read Pandora's Star, read it. It's not military sci-fi. It's just straight
I've read a
sci-fi.
bunch of Peter's stuff. I'll have to give that one. I haven't read that one though. I'll give that a shot.
It's that there's two of them. It's Pandora's Star and Judas Unchained. It's a pair of books.
I'll tell
There's
you,
a bigger universe.
I read the Night's Dawn trilogy, and it was incredibly well written, and with the world building was amazing, but it was so brutal.
Yeah.
that I don't really want to reread it.
Yeah. I've read Pandora's Star like 4 times, and they're monster books. And I always like to say this when people talk about not ending their book on cliffhangers.
Literally,
He ends his book 1 on a literal cliffhanger with them going over a cliff. And like, I was like, what? And the first time I read it, I was listening to it on audiobook and I didn't realize that I was coming to the end. And they were like, "Boop," and I'm like, wait a minute, the book is over. Did I miss something? Nope.
Things you can do when you're already established.
100%.
Right. In Rendezvous with Rama, it opens up with the main character like jumping through gates so he can just extend his birthday. It's like his 100th birthday or something, I think. And it was just one of those.
That was that sounds like Larry Niven's Louis
Oh.
Wu.
You're right. It's not Rendezvous with Rama. It's
Ringworld. It's Ringworld.
Ringworld. Yeah. It's just one of those things. I was like, here's a concept that he probably thought was cool, but he didn't think it through all the way for the effect on the rest of the story. I don't know.
Right.
If you had tech like that, yeah, everything else that happened in the Ringworld. But anyway, is it Ringworld or no? It's Rendezvous with Rama that Villanueva is going to make. Or I heard it's.
I think it's Rama. I think it's Rendezvous.
Who's
with
going to
Rama.
make it?
Dennis. I'm mispronouncing his name. The guy who did Dune.
Villeneuve. Denis Villeneuve.
Villeneuve. Okay.
Mr. I don't like dialogue.
Yeah, I heard that. Hey, just keep making those super cool broad scenes of Empire stuff. That's pretty cool.
I can't wait to see Dune
Yeah.
2.
Yeah, same.
I'm
Maybe
pretty.
we should do after we all see it. We should just do a podcast just reviewing Dune 2 because we talked about maybe doing movies.
We did.
And that one's
Yeah, that works.
culturally and there's a lot of military in it. So
Yeah.
and on that note,
Long live the fighters.
I know. Raise your
I was just
Chris
waiting
knife.
for James to rudely cut somebody off again this week. So
I was looking for an opportunity, but I think Jeff inserted an excellent segue, so I don't have to cut anybody off.
Nice.
Anyway, thank you for listening. Check us out on our Discord, which we'll get a link up to that at some point. And we may have enough episodes now that we can almost go live. We'll talk about it. So we were getting some in the can so that we have breathing room. But anyway, thank you for listening, and we will see you again next time.
Load up, troopers on a hidden jump gate. Military science fiction podcast.